The Cuban economy is facing profound challenges, with approximately 88% of its population living in poverty. Yet, this was once hailed as one of the most stunning places on Earth. Cuba emerged as an economic powerhouse, particularly in the 1920s, when its sugar industry generated immense wealth. Its breathtaking beaches and proximity to the United States, which was thirsty during Prohibition, turned Cuba into a sought-after destination for American tourists. By the late 1950s, Cuba ranked as the world's 29th largest economy, surpassing nations like Ireland and Australia in GDP per capita. Despite its small population, Cuba seemed destined for prosperity, thanks to its free market, educated workforce, and natural riches. However, today, Cubans endure significant economic hardships. The 1990s witnessed food shortages, malnutrition, frequent blackouts, economic contraction, soaring unemployment, and mass emigration. So, how did Cuba transition from prosperity to poverty? And how is this situation getting worse? Let's get straight into it. To understand the core issues, let's delve into history. Cuba gained independence at the turn of the 20th century after 400 years of Spanish rule and years of conflict. However, the US intervened, aiming to protect its interests in Cuba's lucrative sugar industry. After World War I, Europe's sugar production declined, leading to a surge in sugar prices. This windfall flooded Cuba with wealth, but it was short-lived. Many farmers faced crippling debt, leading to bank failures and American acquisition of Cuban assets. Despite these fluctuations, Cuba's economy received another boost from American tourism post-World War I. In the early 20th century, while Europe recovered from conflict and the US banned alcohol, Cuba emerged as a top vacation spot. American tourists flooded in, boosting the economy. However, wealth was concentrated, leaving sugar farmers struggling and many in poverty. Corruption plagued the government, led by Batista's dictatorship. Dissatisfaction grew, leading to support for Fidel Castro's revolution. Initially portrayed as anti-communist, Castro enacted reforms upon seizing power, including agrarian reform and nationalization of US-owned investments. A trade partnership with the USSR further strained US-Cuban relations, culminating in the US embargo. Castro nationalized Cuban refineries, triggering a US backlash. The US slashed the sugar quota, crippling Cuba's economy. In retaliation, Castro seized all US-owned assets, cutting diplomatic ties. Subsequent US actions, like the embargo and Bay of Pigs invasion, worsened Cuba's plight. Castro's shift to socialism saw widespread nationalizations, centralizing all operations under state control. Under socialist rule, Cuba struggled with inefficiencies, shortages, and a declining economy. Despite education and healthcare initiatives, productivity plummeted, exacerbated by the exodus of skilled professionals. Agriculture, the mainstay, saw a 23% output drop post-revolution. Soviet aid kept the economy afloat temporarily, but Cuba's socialist experiment proved disastrous, compounded by Castro's oppressive regime. In 1971, Cuba's economy lagged behind pre-revolution levels, prompting its entry into the Comecon alliance with the Soviet Union. Transitioning to a planned economy in 1972 improved efficiency, with mechanization in the sugar industry and Soviet aid bolstering growth. By the 1980s, cracks appeared to show due to over-reliance on sugar exports and Soviet subsidies. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 devastated Cuba, losing 35% of its economy and 80% of its trade. Shortages ensued, with food scarcity and power outages rampant. Castro's regime adapted by adopting a dual economy, blending state-run socialism with side-free market to survive in a capitalist world. Half of state enterprises shuttered, leaving many jobless. Limited self-employment options emerged. Dollarization and foreign investment legalization revitalized tourism, boosting the economy by $2 billion annually. Disparities arose. Service workers earned more than professionals. Cubans faced shortages while tourists enjoyed luxury. Economic reforms widened the wealth gap, stifling progress. Raúl Castro's leadership saw limited economic transformation attempts. Economic woes deepened in the late 2000s due to low sugar prices, natural disasters, and tourism stagnation. The government revised income calculation methods in response to mounting challenges. However, these issues appear minor in comparison to the current ones. In many countries, food comes from both public and private sources. However, Cuba's communist system centralizes and controls the entire food supply process. Farming is already challenging due to shortages of pesticides, fuel, and equipment, which need to be imported, along with facing the worst drought in a century. Currently, the government determines prices and production quotas for farmers, collects their crops, and manages distribution. However, most economists agree that this discourages farmers from being more productive, leading to a bureaucratic and inefficient system. Similar systems failed in the Soviet Union and are failing in Cuba. Consequently, Cuba relies on imports for about 70% of its food, which has become more expensive due to a 40% increase in global prices caused by the pandemic. Purchasing food internationally requires foreign currency, which Cuba lacks due to various factors, including mismanagement by its leaders and the ongoing US embargo, which the leaders often blame for the country's economic struggles. A comprehensive trade embargo was initially enforced by President Kennedy following Fidel Castro's rise to power in the Cuban Revolution. This embargo comprises a series of laws and regulations prohibiting US companies from engaging in trade with entities associated with the Cuban state. These sanctions also complicate business transactions with Cuba for international companies, particularly due to the predominant use of US dollars in global trade, necessitating transactions through US banks. Despite maintaining trade valued at hundreds of millions of dollars with other countries such as China, Spain, and Germany, the US embargo increases the time and cost involved. Since nearly all aspects of Cuba's economy are owned or controlled by the state or military, the sanctions impact not only Cuba's leadership, but the entire economy.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba.
During President Obama's tenure, many sanctions were eased, and Cuba was removed from the US list of state sponsors of terrorism. However, his successor, President Trump, reversed this policy, reinstated Cuba on the terror list, and imposed approximately 200 additional sanctions targeting government ministries and military-affiliated businesses. So far, President Biden has maintained existing sanctions and even imposed additional ones against Cuban officials, following the crackdown on protesters in July. It's evident that Cuba's capacity to support its people, which is supposed to be the cornerstone of the Cuban model, is facing unprecedented pressure. Gone are the days of Cuba's affluent allies. For decades, it relied on the Soviet Union, but with its collapse in the 1990s, Cuba's economy suffered a significant blow. This marked Cuba's last major crisis. In the 2000s, Venezuela emerged as a new ally, providing Cuba with heavily discounted oil for consumption and resale. However, due to the US sanctions and Venezuela's economic and oil sector collapse, oil shipments to Cuba have drastically declined. Consequently, Cuba is struggling to maintain basic services. Given the prolonged economic challenges, many Cubans have depended on remittances, money sent from relatives abroad, particularly those residing in the US. These remittances represented a crucial source of dollars for the Cuban economy. However, even this source has diminished compared to previous levels. During President Trump's administration, companies such as Western Union were prohibited from sending cash due to their collaboration with a Cuban bank owned by the military. Consequently, a significant cash flow ceased. Moreover, Cubans face considerable challenges within their own currency as the peso lacks purchasing power for essential needs. The situation worsened when the government devalued the peso in January as part of a major currency restructuring. This scenario presents a complex dilemma. Additionally, the pandemic exacerbated Cuba's economic strain by severely reducing another vital revenue stream: tourist spending. International visitor arrivals plummeted by nearly 90%. Furthermore, the pandemic inflicted profound damage on Cuba's healthcare system, which has often been lauded as a relative success compared to some of its counterparts in Latin America. However, unlike its Caribbean counterparts, Cuba did not experience a complete resurgence in tourism. As of October 2022, the number of international visitors remained at less than half of the total recorded for the same month in 2019. Despite Cuba's shift towards permitting certain types of small private businesses in 2021, advancements in further market reforms have halted. Economic dysfunction stands as a leading factor, prompting hundreds of thousands of Cubans to depart from the island. And the problems are far from over. In 2021, President Díaz-Canel terminated a dual currency system that had been in place for nearly 2 decades, resulting in one of the most significant currency devaluations globally. Cuba, which relies on imports for approximately 70% of its food supply, has witnessed a surge in food prices. Concurrently, the island's inflation rate stands as one of the highest in Latin America and the Caribbean, hovering around 200%, with Cuba's rate declining at a slower pace compared to its regional counterparts. This pervasive dysfunction has further exacerbated widespread discontent. However, Díaz-Canel has demonstrated no inclination towards political liberalization. Instead, he implemented a new penal code in May 2022, which heightened the criminalization of dissent. A year earlier, tens of thousands protested nationwide, the largest unrest in nearly 30 years. Despite crackdowns, protests surged in October 2022 due to a prolonged blackout from Hurricane Ian. Historically, Cuba's elections had over 95% turnout, enforced through media, employer and local government pressure, with consequences for abstention. However, on March 26th, a record 1 in 4 Cubans abstained or spoiled ballots, signaling defiance against the regime. Turnout declined by 10% compared to 2018. This trend continued in September's referendum on same-sex marriage and November's municipal elections, showing resistance to legitimizing the regime. On April 19th, Díaz-Canel secured a new 5-year term with overwhelming support. Despite widespread discontent shown through mass protests and record abstention rates, Cuba's repressive one-party system blocks avenues for grassroots change. Economic turmoil and repression drive Cubans to emigrate, with 374,000 detained at the US border since fiscal year 2021, marking a significant emigration wave. Nicaragua's removal of visa requirements for Cubans aids this exodus, serving Cuba's regime by easing internal pressure. Furthermore, Cuba's pervasive state intelligence network and severe penalties for activism hinder organizations. Hence, the economy shows no signs of improvement, while persistent crises in a transition to Díaz-Canel's generation could exacerbate instability. That's it for today, and now we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel if you like our content. We will catch you in the next one.